So I'm just going to be here for 20 minutes or maybe 20 and a bit to share a few stories with you of our work to help the ideas of stretch collaboration and especially embracing conflict and connection to come more alive through stories. Each of these stories is part of a much bigger story, and there are lots of full stories on our website and in Adam's books and so on, where you get the whole picture. I'm just going to focus on 4 little vignettes of things, experiences from our processes, or sort of moments in our processes that each link to a important but non-obvious and in some ways counterintuitive insight that we've had from doing this work over many years. So I'm going to share my screen just to show you a few photos. It's just 4 slides, and when I do that, I won't be able to read the chat, and I most likely won't be seeing all your faces. So if you can be chatting with each other, but if anybody needs to stop me to clarify anything, if I've missed something or if something's not clear, then just shout, okay? So let me share my screen here. Oops. Okay, well, there you see all my slides in one go. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. All right, so the first story that I want to share, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So the first story is actually not a story of my own, except to the extent that it's the story that first captivated me and introduced me to this work, and that made me decide that this was what I wanted to do with my life. So Adam shared this story with me when I first met him in 1999, and it's the story of Destino Colombia, which some of you may be familiar with. So the essence of it is that in 1996, Adam was invited to Colombia to facilitate a process to develop scenarios for the future of the country at a time of intense armed conflict. And he was invited by Juan Manuel Santos, who at the time was a young politician and later became president of Colombia many years later. And this process involved what I would call a radically diverse group. So it had politicians, activists, business people, but also trade unionists and the guerrillas themselves. So the guerrillas were dialing in from prison, hiding, and exile. And so it was obviously very uncommon to have such a group together. And the moment in the process that I want to focus on is that at the beginning of the process, one of the FARC representatives, so one of the guerrillas, asked Adam, do we have to agree to a ceasefire to participate? And Adam says, I didn't have this on my list of frequently asked questions. So he thought about it and he answered no. The only thing you have to agree to is participate and to talk and to listen. And I think that's a key insight in our work, how he decided to answer that question. And it's actually a question that, if you think of it more broadly, now that was an intense conflict situation, but if you think of ceasefire, not as necessarily in relation to an armed struggle, but if you think of it as resistance, protest, fighting, demonstrations, then it's a question that we get repeatedly when we're convening. There's an assumption or a fear, especially among those who don't have a primary interest in the status quo or who are less powerful in the system, that collaborating will somehow disempower you and that you have to stop fighting for what you believe in order to sit down at the table with your more powerful opponents. And so when that question comes to us, for us to say, no, you don't have to stop protesting. You can still use your power in the way that you feel is right. You can engage in our process and be talking and listening in our process and still be demonstrating on the outside, or still be participating in activist campaigns, or still be taking up arms outside the room. That's an extremely liberating answer for people. And it's it enables them to, it lowers the barrier to collaborating, and it acknowledges that the fighting outside the room serves a purpose. That fighting that happens outside the room is generating discomfort. It's maybe leveling the playing field, it's raising consciousness, And sometimes that's needed to get to the level of discomfort that allows people to engage. But of course, when you're inside the room, the idea is to talk and listen. So this is the first insight that I want to share with you about embracing conflict and connection, that you don't actually have to agree to a ceasefire. Of course, a ceasefire is desirable, but it's not a requirement to engage. It's not a requirement to collaborate. The second story may seem very different, but it actually has a lot of similarities, surprisingly. So this is a story of a project that we're currently still engaged in. We started last year. It's in the north of the Netherlands. Okay, so very different context from Colombia, a peaceful country, but a very tense situation in the north of the Netherlands, where the gas extraction has led to earthquakes. Damage claims have been very slow to be processed, and essentially the local actors feel that their interests have been subsumed, undermined or deprioritized in relation to the interests of fossil fuel companies, the economy, and the national government. And that's led to a lot of anger, a lot of activism, and essentially to enemifying the fossil fuel companies in particular, but also in some cases the national government, or criticizing the national government. We got involved in this process last year. It's also a process where we're building scenarios for the future of the region. And part of the tricky setup here was that one of the fossil fuel companies was actually one of the conveners, not the only convener, but they were in the convening group, and they were funding the process. And so it was very difficult for local activists who were enemifying this company to join that process. But some people who are involved with activist groups were convinced. Sorry, that's not me. Okay. Some people involved with those activist groups, agreed to join the process because they believed in it. And at a certain point, it was very difficult to convene. It was very difficult for them to join. And what they experienced was that some of their collaborators outside of the room called them traitors. And that was a very painful experience for them, to be seen as traitors by their allies, because of agreeing to sit down in this process that was supported, and which was a chance to engage in dialogue with the fossil fuel company. And it reminded me that Santos actually says that he experienced that as well. I think Adam asked him what was the most difficult part about achieving peace, and he said that it was being called a traitor. And so this is actually also something that we see repeatedly. You turn the volume up and down on it, but when you convene such radically diverse groups, the reality is that they are also taking a risk, and it's a very courageous step for them to join that group. I think often when we're facilitating such groups, we think that everyone will be happy to join this process and to work towards a shared purpose and so on. But Adam talks about this dual meaning of the word collaborator, that you're partly collaborating in a positive way, but the word collaborator is also like, that's the idea of the collaborating with the enemy title of the book. It's also, reminds you of, it's also the word that was used for people who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and so on. So it is also when you're compromising your own group, to join an enemy. And that is actually the challenge that our stakeholders often face when they choose to join such processes and sit down with their opponents, is that they do risk being seen as traitors. And it has to do with this idea of holons that I understand somebody asked a question about yesterday. So when we as facilitators say, no, just join and work for the harmony of the whole, the benefit of the whole, there isn't just one whole for these people. These people are at the intersection of multiple wholes. Our process is only one of the wholes that they're a part of. They're also a part of the whole, which is their activist group, and they're also part of a whole, which is their family and their gender group, or other wholes that all have different interests that are at stake and at play here. And often that's called agendas. You know, people are bringing their agendas, and those agendas are delegitimized. But what we try to do is to actually acknowledge that tension, acknowledge the courage of stepping into these processes, trying to, you know, recognize that participants are parts of multiple wholes, and not delegitimizing those agendas. And I think it's helpful to even, you know, name up front that there's this risk of betrayal, and, you know, warn people that might happen to them, or they might feel that compromise. So the lesson here is the counterintuitive part of it is to acknowledge agendas and acknowledge the risk of betrayal, rather than calling agendas illegitimate, and you know, saying that we're all working for the harmony of the whole. The third story is a story of a project in Brazil, where we convened the education sector in Brazil, so many different stakeholders from the education system. It was also a very tense situation where they had been, you know, there's a lot of tension between a sort of rights-based approach to education and a more merit-based approach to education that's focused on quality as opposed to access. And this group of stakeholders, all looking very grumpy here, had come out of a 3-year negotiation for a national education plan that had only made their relationships more tense. And, you know, so they've been debating this national education plan, and they've become more angry at each other. And they came into our process straight from that experience. In order to convene such a diverse group, we had to convene a convening alliance that already had these different voices in the room, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get these different perspectives in. So we had a convening alliance of 6 organizations that already had this rift right at the core of it. So facilitating the convening alliance was almost more difficult than facilitating the bigger group, but that allowed us to bring this diverse multi-stakeholder group together. And they refused to be called a team. They said, no collective action will emerge from this process. It's purely for us to learn and purely for us to stimulate public debate on education. Over the course of the process, all they agreed on was what 4 scenarios to communicate externally, and they agreed on which of the scenarios was to be avoided. And they agreed on the basic principle of the right of education, and they agreed to do communication events together. So they got up on stages and shared their scenarios together. And what's happened since then is that the 4th scenario that they all agreed was the negative one is really coming to pass in Brazil. And so they're working together around preventing that scenario, really building on the relationships that they built over the course of the process. So their relationships really transformed over the course of the process, and they learned to understand each other's point of view and to collaborate without necessarily having to agree. And so the lesson here is that you don't have to agree as much as you think. So you do have to agree on some things, and Brazil does need a national education plan, which is a process of what we would call conventional collaboration, which is sometimes needed. So sometimes you have to agree on how to allocate time, money, effort, who's going to do what. But we try to agree much more than we actually need to. We often think we have to agree on the definition of the problem, which I would argue that we actually hardly ever need to agree on. A lot of our desire to agree is actually just because we feel better if everybody agrees with us. We'll feel happier if we know that we're right and that others share our opinion. But actually, a lot of advancing is possible without that agreement. Sometimes the most resilient actions are the ones that people agree to for different reasons. So you don't have to agree as much as you think. And I encourage you to always ask yourselves a question like, what do we actually have to agree on, and what don't we have to agree on? Where can we accept our differences? So it's not to say you never have to agree. There are some things that are important to agree on, but not as much as we think. Final story, just very quickly. This is a process that we're involved in called the Sustainable Oceans Lab. It's a platform, and this particular photo is from a process in 2015, 2016, which David was also involved in, where we brought together ocean stakeholders, a very diverse group of global ocean stakeholders, including intergovernmental organizations, companies, community-based organizations, local fishermen, local community leaders. And the example of conflict that I want to share with you is actually not about oceans, even though there's plenty of conflict in the ocean space as well, primarily between sort of sustainability and blue economy. But the moment, or the vignette, is a moment in this process where over a couple of days, so there was one of the working groups that had 5 white men in the group, and you can see it's a relatively diverse group. So there weren't so many white men, and 5 of the white men were in the same group. And there was this joke that kind of kept surfacing where people would talk about it as the white men's group. And we noticed this as facilitators when it started cycling. It wasn't something that just happened once, it happened multiple times. And we then asked the question, like, how do you, we've just noticed that this white men's joke has been coming up multiple times, and we asked different people, we asked the white men, how do you feel about that? And how do other participants feel about that? And actually in that same group with the 5 white men, there was a Black woman. And she said, well, I feel completely overlooked when this is called the 5 white men, it's called the white men's group. And so the accusation of the white men's group was also, the people accusing a group of being the white men's group was also overlooking the Black woman in the group. And it was a real moment of sort of insight and learning in this group, which, even though it has nothing to do with oceans, it was getting in the way. It was a conflict that was getting in the way. And working on it allowed for a surfacing of insight and wisdom that then strengthened the relationships in the group. And I think everyone in this group, if you ask them today, they would remember that moment in the process. And so the lesson from that is that conflict, if embraced, can be a source of wisdom. And it's very important to catch the conflict. So one of you said, I think on your checkout yesterday or now in the chat room, that that it's important not to avoid conflict. And that's the lesson here, that when you see conflict under the surface, even if it's a small conflict, bring it to the surface, work with it, and then it helps the whole group to learn and strengthens the relationships and allows you to move forward. And if you allow it to fester and try to avoid it, then it only becomes stronger and will get more in the way. So those are my 4 vignettes. I hope I made it more or less on time. I'll stop sharing.